The rain arrives before Esther does. It comes down hard and sideways, the kind that doesn't fall so much as it attacks, drumming against the iron gate of the estate, flooding the gutters, turning the street into a dark mirror that reflects nothing clearly. By the time Esther reaches the service entrance at the rear of the property, her hoodie is soaked through, her sneakers waterlogged, her breath coming out in small white clouds against the cold. She doesn't knock. She has a key. She has had one for 3 months and has never once been invited through the front door. That is the first thing you understand about Esther before a single word explains her. She enters a mansion through the back, alone in the rain, and nobody notices she has arrived. Inside, the estate is silent in the way that expensive things are silent. Not peaceful, but controlled. Every surface gleams. Every hallway stretches long and cold under lights that hum just below the range of hearing. Esther moves through it the way she has learned to move through every space in her life. Small, efficient, careful. She wrings out her sleeve over the utility sink. She ties her hair back. She picks up her mop without being asked because there is no one there to ask. She starts at the east wing and works toward the center of the house. The way she always does. She is almost to the far corridor when she hears it. She stops. It is barely a sound. Something between a breath held too long and the kind of quiet that comes after crying, not before it. It is coming from behind the door at the end of the hall. The door with no handle on the outside. She was told on her very first day to leave alone. Esther stands in the corridor with water dripping from the hem of her jacket onto the marble floor. She knows the rules. She has followed it for 3 months without once questioning it because in a house like this, you do not ask about the doors you are told not to open. That is how you keep a job. That is how you stay safe. That is how you survive. She opens the door. The room on the other side is dark, small, and warm in a way that feels accidental, like the heat came from a body trying to keep itself alive rather than from any system designed for comfort. There is a narrow cot against one wall, a plastic cup on the floor, a small lamp with no shade casting a circle of yellow light. And in the corner, knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped around her own shins, sits a little girl. If this story has you hooked, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. She is small, maybe 6 years old, with dark straight hair falling across her face and eyes that are too steady for a child who has clearly been frightened for a long time. She does not scream when the door opens. She does not cry. She simply looks up at Esther the way a person looks at something they have stopped expecting. Not with hope, but with the flat, careful attention of someone who has learned that hope costs more than it returns. Esther's hand stays on the door frame. The mop leans against the wall behind her. The hum of the hallway lights is the only sound. She should close the door. Every sensible part of her brain, the part that has kept her fed and employed and out of trouble, is telling her to close the door and walk back down the hall and finish her shift and go home and forget what she saw. She has her own problems. She has rent and a phone bill and a sister who calls too late at night with emergencies that cost money she doesn't have. She cannot afford to be curious about a sealed room in a crime lord's estate. Esther steps inside. She reaches into her bag and pulls out the only food she has, half a sandwich wrapped in foil, left over from the lunch she didn't finish. She crouches down to the little girl's level and holds it out without a word. The girl looks at the sandwich. Then at Esther. Then at the sandwich again. She takes it. That is where the story really begins. Not with a decision Esther carefully weighed and made, but with a reflex, the same one that had always gotten her into trouble and kept her human at the same time. The little girl's name, Esther would learn over the coming weeks, was Lillian. And the choice made in that small dark room would pull both of their lives apart at the seams. Esther did not tell anyone. She went back to the hallway, finished her shift, mopped the same floor she always mopped, and went home on the last bus in the rain. But the next evening she came back, and the evening after that, and she began building something into the rhythm of her shifts that no one had given her permission to build. She started with food. Small things that fit in her bag without notice. Soft bread, fruit, crackers sealed in their packaging. She would slip into Lillian's room for 15 minutes at the end of each shift, after the rest of the house was locked down and the other staff had gone. She would sit on the floor with her back against the cot, and Lillian would sit beside her and Esther would talk. She told the girl about the neighborhood where she grew up, about the corner store run by an old man who gave children candy if they could answer a math question, about the smell of her grandmother's kitchen on Sunday mornings. She didn't know how much Lillian understood. The girl's English was thin and fragile, a few words strung together without grammar. But she listened with her whole body, leaning slightly toward Esther the way a plant leans toward light, and Esther kept talking because the listening felt like something. She taught Lillian words. Cup, window, rain, warm, safe, Lillian repeated them back with careful concentration, tasting each sound on her tongue before committing it, storing them somewhere deep and private. She had a serious approach to learning that reminded Esther of students she had known who grew up with very little and understood, in some instinctive way, that knowledge was one of the few things that couldn't be taken from you once you had it. When Esther said a word correctly enough to make Lillian nod with satisfaction, a small thing happened in the girl's face, not quite a smile, but the shape of one beginning to form underneath the stillness. Esther found herself thinking about Lillian on the bus home. She found herself saving half her lunch instead of eating it, rearranging what was in her bag to make room. She had not asked for this. She was a woman who had spent the better part of 30 years managing carefully, keeping her circle small and her obligations manageable, because the world had taught her early that caring too much about things you couldn't control was a fast way to be broken. And here she was, reorganizing her entire day around 15 minutes with a child she had no legal or logical claim to protect. She told herself it was temporary. She almost believed it. Esther braided Lillian's hair in the third week. She had noticed it was getting tangled, no one was tending to it, and the girl couldn't quite reach the back sections herself. She asked first, holding up the comb she'd brought from home, waiting. Lillian looked at the comb. Then at Esther. Then she turned around and sat cross-legged with her back to Esther and her shoulders very straight, like she was preparing for something formal. Lillian sat very still throughout it, the way children do when they are not yet sure if being touched will hurt. Esther worked through the tangles gently, taking her time, talking quietly about nothing in particular. About a song she liked, about the way the market smelled in the morning, about the color of the sky when a storm was ending. When she was done, she ran her thumb along the edge of the braid to smooth it. Lillian reached up and ran her own fingers along it slowly, feeling the neatness of it from the roots down. Then she turned and looked at Esther with the most direct look she had given her yet. Not the careful, guarded look of a child deciding whether to trust. Something cleaner than that. Good, Lillian said. It was the first word she had offered without being prompted. Not in response to a lesson, not a repetition. Just a judgment offered freely, about something that had been done for her. Esther had to look away to keep her face steady. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment and breathed through her nose and looked at the ceiling. Then she looked back at Lillian and said, "Yes. Good." She did not notice King watching her until the fourth week. She was crossing from the kitchen to the main corridor late in an evening shift when she felt it, the specific weight of being observed by someone who is very good at not being seen. She looked up toward the second-floor landing and there he was, standing in the shadow at the top of the stairs. Tall still, his face giving away nothing. He did not move when she saw him. He did not look away. Neither did she. Then she picked up her bucket and kept walking, because she had learned a long time ago that in houses like this, the worst thing you could do was let a powerful man know he had rattled you. King said nothing. But the next morning, Esther's keycard was updated. It opened 2 new sections of the estate. One of them was the kitchen, which meant she could bring Lillian real food now, warm food, without hiding it in her bag. She stood at the kitchen counter reading the new access level on the card for a long time. She didn't understand what it meant yet. But she felt it. The summons came on a Tuesday. One of King's men found Esther in the middle of stripping a floor in the west hallway and told her simply that Mr. King wanted to see her. No further detail. No expression on his face to read. Esther set down her mop, dried her hands on her work pants and followed him. King's office was at the center of the estate, a room that looked like it had been designed to make people feel small. Dark wood, tall windows, no clutter anywhere. King was standing when she entered, his back to the room, looking out at the rain-soaked garden below. He waited until the door clicked shut behind her before he spoke. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked. His voice was even like a man asking about the weather. Esther had prepared for this moment in every way she could think of on the walk down the hallway. She had prepared an apology. She had prepared an explanation about not wanting to overstep, about thinking the child might be a relative, about all the careful, reasonable-sounding reasons a person might offer to a man who could fire her or do worse. All of it dissolved the moment she opened her mouth. "Because she looked like she'd already been told she didn't matter," Esther said. "And I know what that feels like." The silence that followed was long enough to be uncomfortable. King turned from the window. He looked at her the way he had looked at her from the landing, that still, measuring look that gave nothing back. "You could have gone to the police," he said. "I could have," Esther agreed. She did not elaborate. He studied her for another long moment. Then he said, "You're dismissed," and turned back to the window. Esther walked back down the hallway expecting her keycard to stop working at the next door. It didn't. It opened everything it had opened before. And the following week, it opened one additional room, a small sitting area near Lillian's room with a proper chair and a lamp, where Esther could sit with the child in more than cramped darkness. She understood then that she had passed some kind of test she hadn't known she was taking. She just didn't know yet what passing it would cost. The fear came in slowly, the way cold seeps through a wall, not all at once, but in the quiet moments when she wasn't braced for it. She heard things. Not clearly, not with context, but in the way that people who are meant to be invisible often hear things. A conversation ending when she entered a room, two men speaking low and fast in Korean near the rear entrance, a phone call taken in the hallway instead of an office. The tone of the household had shifted in a way that was hard to name but impossible to ignore. The staff moved differently. Faster. With their eyes down. One of the older women who usually chatted with Esther near the linen closet had stopped making eye contact. Something was closing in. Esther could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives. She pieced it together in fragments. A name she heard twice in passing. A rival organization spoken with the particular kind of quiet that people use for things they are afraid of. A reference to the girl in a conversation she was not meant to hear. The realization landing in her chest like a stone, that Lillian was not simply hidden. Lillian was a target. She was the thing that could be used against King if the wrong people found her. And Esther had been visiting her twice a week for over a month. She sat on the bus home one night with her hands folded in her lap and thought about it clearly for the first time. She had a choice. She could stop coming. She could tell her agency she needed a new placement, cite personal reasons, disappear from this estate and this situation with her safety intact. King would understand. He might even respect it. She had not signed up for whatever this was. Nobody would blame her. Most people would call it the only sensible thing to do. She had been sensible her entire life. She had been careful and quiet and small and sensible, and it had kept her alive and kept her employed and kept her out of trouble, and it had also left her, at 31 years old, riding a night bus alone in the rain with nothing and no one waiting for her at home except a phone that needed a new screen and a plant she kept forgetting to water. Being sensible had cost her things she had not finished adding up yet. She thought about Lillian's hands gripping the braid to feel how neat it was. She thought about the girl saying good, with the seriousness of someone making a formal assessment. She thought about the way Lillian pressed close without being invited, trusting the warmth before she had fully decided to trust the person providing it. She thought about the fact that she herself had been a child once who understood exactly what it meant to be in a room that people walked past without opening. She thought about Lillian's hands gripping the braid to feel how neat it was. She thought about the girl saying good, with the seriousness of someone making a formal assessment. The next evening, Esther came back. She told herself it was just to make sure the girl was all right. She told herself a lot of things. But when she sat down on the floor of that small warm room and Lillian immediately pressed close to her side without being invited, Esther stopped trying to reason her way out of what she already knew. She loved this child. It had happened quietly, without ceremony, in the space of ordinary moments. And she was not going to walk away from it. The night it broke open was a Thursday. King and most of his men had been gone since morning. She had seen the convoy leave from the window of the upper hall. The estate felt hollower than usual, the silence having a different quality to it, thinner. Esther worked her shift at the same pace she always did, moving through the rooms in the same order, trying not to let the emptiness change how she carried herself. She was gathering her supplies from the utility closet near the east wing when the lights went out. Not a flicker. Not a surge. All at once, the entire estate dropped into darkness. Esther stood very still in the sudden black. The hum of the building disappeared. The only sound was the rain against the windows and her own breathing. She counted to 3. The backup generators should have kicked in. They didn't. Then she heard the rear door. It wasn't a loud sound. It was a careful sound, which was worse, the careful sound of people who knew what they were doing and were trying not to be heard. A soft crack of a frame giving way. Feet on the utility corridor floor. Esther did not think. She pulled her phone out for its flashlight, kept the beam low, and moved. She went to Lillian's room first. She always went to Lillian's room first, even in her mind, even when she was planning anything. It was simply where she was oriented from now. She pressed the door open and found Lillian already sitting up on the cot, awake, her eyes wide and fixed on the door like she had been waiting for exactly this. "Come here," Esther said. Low and steady. Lillian came. She didn't ask questions. Children who have learned to live in fear know when it is time to move. She slipped off the cot and Esther pulled her close, wrapping her own jacket around the girl's small shoulders, and they went out the far door of the room that led to the side corridor. Away from the sounds at the back of the house. Away from the careful footsteps getting closer. They went out through the garden door and into the rain. The streets outside the estate were dark and slick, the rain driving down in cold sheets that soaked through Esther's shirt within seconds. She pulled Lillian tighter against her chest. The girl had her arms locked around Esther's neck, her face pressed into her shoulder, not making a sound. She was light in the way that children who haven't been eating enough are light, and Esther adjusted her grip and moved. She didn't run. Running draws eyes and sound, and the men behind them were professionals. She knew that much. She walked fast, cutting through side streets, staying off the main road, moving in the direction of the market district because she knew it, because she'd walked it 4 times a week for 3 months, because there were people there even at this hour, and people meant witnesses. She felt them before she heard them. That specific awareness of being tracked. The way the hairs on your arms rise not because you've seen something but because some older part of your brain has. She glanced back without breaking stride. 2 figures half a block behind, dark clothed, not running. Just walking the same direction she was walking. Methodical. They weren't chasing her. They were following her, which was different and worse because it meant they were patient and it meant they had a plan. She kept moving. Lillian's breathing was warm against her neck. Esther focused on that, the small proof of the child being alive and close, and let it be the only thing that mattered. She did not let herself think about what happened if she made the wrong turn. She picked the next street and then the one after that and moved through the rain-dark city with her arms full of the only thing worth protecting. She was 3 blocks from the market when she saw the lights of Mr. Cho's stall, the old fruit vendor who had chatted with her every morning on her way to the estate, who always gave her a tangerine she never asked for, who had grandchildren whose names she knew because he told her about them constantly. He was the most ordinary person in her life. He was also the only person she trusted at this particular moment in this particular city on this particular night. His cart was still out, its bare bulb strung up under a piece of canvas. He was packing up for the night. She could have wept from relief. Esther made the decision before she had consciously decided to make it. She crossed the street at an angle, shielding Lillian from the sight line of the figures behind her, and reached Cho's cart. The old man looked up. She must have looked wild, soaked and wide-eyed and holding a child in the rain, because his face changed immediately. She leaned close and spoke directly into his ear. She told him an address. She told him to get a cab, that she would pay him back, that he needed to take this child there and not stop for anyone. She told him the child's name was Lillian. Cho looked at her. Then he looked at Lillian, who was watching him with those steady, serious eyes. Go, Esther told him. She passed Lillian into his arms. Lillian's hands gripped Esther's sleeve for one moment, tight, desperate, and then let go. It was the most deliberate thing the child had ever done. As if she understood and was choosing to trust it. Esther turned around and walked back in the direction she had come. They caught her 2 blocks from the market, in an alley that offered nothing but a wall at her back and wet asphalt under her feet. There were 2 of them up close and she didn't see them until they were already there, which meant they were very good at what they did. One of them said something in Korean. The other one simply waited. Esther said nothing. Her jaw was set. Her hands were shaking. She noticed that the way you notice weather as a fact about the world, not as something belonging to her. They asked her in English this time where the child was. She looked at the space between them and said nothing. One of them moved toward her and she didn't step back, which seemed to surprise him briefly. The wall met her shoulder blades. The rain kept coming. She kept her mouth closed. She was on her knees on the pavement when she heard the cars. 3 of them, flooding the alley entrance with headlights sharp enough to make everyone freeze. Doors opened. Feet hit the ground. Fast, organized, the same precision as the men in front of her but with numbers and authority behind it. The 2 figures made a calculation that took about 2 seconds, and then they ran because running was the only math that made sense. In the sudden white brightness of the headlights, Esther looked up from the wet ground and saw King crouching beside her. His coat was soaked through. His face was not the closed, controlled face she had seen in the office. It was something rawer than that. Something she didn't have a word for. He reached out and put one hand on her shoulder. Esther, he said. It was the first time she had ever heard her name in his voice. It landed differently than she expected. Not like a command, not like the name on a contract. Like something he had been holding carefully and was finally setting down. Lillian, she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. She's safe, he said. We have her. Esther closed her eyes. The rain fell. The headlights stayed on. And the thing she had been bracing against for the past hour, the full weight of what she had just done and almost lost, moved through her like a wave and was gone, leaving her kneeling on the pavement in the cold with King's hand on her shoulder, and nothing left to be afraid of. She woke in a bed that was too soft and a room that was too bright. The ceiling was white. The sheets were white. The light through the window had the particular quality of an overcast morning, gray and even and without direction. Esther lay still for a moment, letting the room come into focus, listening for anything that might tell her what kind of situation she was walking into. A woman in a gray uniform appeared in the doorway. She said she was a nurse. She said Esther was in a private medical facility, that her injuries were minor, bruised ribs, a cut along one forearm, and that she had been asleep for nearly 14 hours. She said that all her expenses were covered. Esther looked at her. "Lillian," she said. "The little girl is safe," the nurse said. "She's been asking for you." Esther let out a breath that had been sitting in her chest for what felt like weeks. "And the man who brought me in," Esther said. "Is he still here?" The nurse paused. Something moved through her expression, not quite discomfort, but a careful neutrality that told Esther the question had a complicated answer. "He's been in the corridor," the nurse said. "Since last night. He hasn't left the building." Esther thought about that for a moment. King, who could be anywhere in the world at any hour of the day, who had an entire organization that required his attention and his authority and his presence, had been sitting in a hospital corridor for 6 hours. Outside a room. Without going in. "Tell him he can come in," she said. He appeared in the doorway a few minutes later. He had changed his coat, but he still had the look of a man who had not slept. He stood at the threshold with his hands at his sides, and there was something almost uncertain about him, not the uncertainty of weakness, but the uncertainty of a man who knows the rules of every room he walks into and has just walked into one where he doesn't know the rules. He looked at Esther in the bed. She looked back at him. "You rode with your men," she said. "You didn't wait at the house." "No," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you went back for her," he said. "And I was not going to be the man who stayed safe while you didn't." The room was very still. Rain again outside the window, softer now, the city washing itself clean. "I need to see her," Esther said. He nodded and stepped back into the corridor. She heard him speak, low, brief, and then the sound of small feet. The door opened the rest of the way and Lillian came through it at a pace that was almost but not quite running, the way children move when they are trying to be careful and urgent at the same time. She crossed the room in a straight line, climbed up onto the bed with the focused determination of someone who has made a decision, and settled against Esther's side with a finality that allowed no argument. Esther put her arm around the girl. Lillian found Esther's braid with her fingers and held on. King stood in the doorway watching this. Something shifted in his face, not a softening exactly, but a kind of settling, the way a structure settles when it finally finds the foundation it was meant to rest on. He stood there for a long moment in which no one said anything and nothing needed to be said. Then, without a word, he walked to the chair beside the bed and sat down. No announcement. No explanation. No transaction offered or accepted. He simply pulled the chair close, set his elbows on his knees, and looked at the window where the rain was tracing slow lines down the glass. A man choosing, for what Esther suspected was the first time in his adult life, to stay somewhere not because it was strategic or safe or because someone had required it of him, but because it was good. Because there was a child asleep against a woman who had bled for her, and both of them were alive, and being in the same room as that felt like the only correct place to be. Esther looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the window too. Outside the rain was slowing. The city below was beginning to catch the first pale light of morning, its wet surfaces holding the glow like they were trying to remember warmth. Somewhere in that city, Lillian had run through the dark in a stranger's arms and trusted it. Somewhere in that city, Esther had turned around and walked back toward danger so a little girl could go free. Somewhere in that city, a man who made his living in the shadows crouched in the rain and said a woman's name like it mattered. None of it had been planned. All of it had been chosen. Lillian's breathing slowed and deepened into sleep. Her grip on Esther's braid did not loosen. Esther kept her arm around the girl and watched the morning come through the window and did not move. King sat in the chair beside the bed and did not move either. The light grew. The rain stopped. And in that quiet hospital room, something that none of them had words for yet began, carefully and without ceremony, to take root. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe.